One decision could end it all. One single choice made in a quiet room. It could erase cities from the map. It could silence the world forever. A moment when everything we know almost vanished. It all came down to a single person. It all came down to a single command. It all came down to one button. That button was real. The danger was real. The silence that followed was a choice, not a certainty. Humanity held its breath. This is the story of that moment. A time when the world stood on the edge of a cliff. A time when fear was a constant companion. The threat was not an earthquake or a storm. It was a weapon made by human hands. A weapon with the power to undo creation itself. We look back now from a safer time, but we must not forget how fragile that safety is. We must remember the ticking clock. We must remember the static on the radio, the hand that hesitated, the finger that did not press. The story begins in the aftermath of a great war, but it leads to the brink of an even greater one. A war that would have no winners. A war that would leave nothing behind but dust and echoes. To understand how close we came, we must go back. We must see the world as it was then. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended one war. They also started a new age of terror. The power unlocked from the atom was unlike anything seen before. A single weapon could now destroy an entire city in a blinding flash. Scientists who had worked on the bomb were horrified by its power. They warned that a world with many such weapons would be a world living on a knife's edge. Their warnings came true. The Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb in 1949. The nuclear arms race had begun. The idea was simple and terrifying. It was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Each side built enough nuclear weapons to completely destroy the other. If one side launched an attack, the other would retaliate before the first missiles even landed. The result would be the annihilation of both nations and likely the rest of the world as well. This balance of terror was supposed to prevent a war. The logic was that no sane leader would start a conflict that would guarantee their own destruction. But this logic was fragile. It depended on perfect information, rational leaders, and no accidents. In October 1962, the shadow grew darker than ever before. An American U-2 spy plane flew high over the island of Cuba. The photographs it took revealed something shocking. The Soviet Union was secretly building launch sites for nuclear missiles. Cuba was only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Missiles launched from there could strike Washington, D.C., New York, other major American cities in minutes. The warning time would be almost zero. This was an unacceptable threat to the United States. The most dangerous moment in history had begun. President John F. Kennedy assembled a team of his closest advisors. They met in secret in the White House. This group, known as XCOM, debated what to do. The options were grim. Some military leaders urged an immediate airstrike to destroy the missile sites. Others called for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy knew that attacking Cuba could trigger a response from the Soviet Union. It could lead directly to a nuclear war. He needed another way, a way to force the missiles out without firing a shot. The clock was ticking. Kennedy chose to implement a naval quarantine around Cuba. It was a blockade in all but name. U.S. Navy warships would surround the island. They would stop and inspect any Soviet ships heading for Cuba. They would turn back any that were carrying military equipment. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the American people on television. He revealed the existence of the missiles. He announced the quarantine. The world listened in stunned silence. The two superpowers were now on a direct collision course. People rushed to grocery stores. They prayed in churches. They waited. Soviet ships carrying more missiles and equipment were steaming toward the quarantine line. American destroyers were waiting for them. On the oceans, U.S. submarines hunted for Soviet submarines. In Florida, American forces prepared for a possible invasion. In the Soviet Union, Premier Nikita Khrushchev and his advisors watched and waited. A single mistake could be catastrophic. A nervous submarine captain, a jumpy pilot, a misunderstood order, any of these could ignite the spark. The fate of the world hung on the actions of men at sea and in command rooms thousands of miles apart. Imagine the control room of a U.S. Navy destroyer. The air is thick with the smell of coffee. The air is thick with the smell of sweat. The only sounds are the low hum of electronics and the ping of sonar. On the radar screen, green dots show the Soviet ships getting closer. The radio crackles with static. Coded messages come over the air. The captain holds his orders. He must stop the Soviet freighter. If it refuses, he is authorized to fire a warning shot. If that fails, he is to disable the ship. Now, imagine a different room. A cramped, hot space deep beneath the waves. This is the control room of a Soviet B-59 submarine. It has been hiding near the quarantine line. American ships above have been dropping small depth charges. They are signals, meant to force the submarine to surface. But the submarine's crew is cut off from Moscow. They do not know if war has already started. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, believes they are under attack. He orders the crew to prepare a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. It has the power of the Hiroshima bomb. The protocol for launching the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of 3 senior officers. The captain wanted to launch. The political officer agreed. The world was one yes away from nuclear war. If they had fired, the American fleet would have been vaporized. The United States would have retaliated with a massive nuclear strike. The Soviet Union would have launched its own missiles in return. It would have been the end. But one man, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. He was the flotilla commander and second in command of the submarine. He argued with the captain. He calmed him down. He refused to give his consent. He could not know for sure what was happening on the surface, but he chose restraint. He chose to de-escalate. What if Vasily Arkhipov had agreed? What if the button had been pushed? We must try to imagine what would have followed. This is not for shock or for drama. It is to understand the stakes. The first flash would have been seen from hundreds of miles away. A silent, blinding light, brighter than 1,000 suns. Then a wave of heat would have followed, moving at the speed of sound. It would have incinerated everything in its path. Cities would have become plains of glass and rubble in an instant. The great buildings of our civilization would have vanished. Monuments, libraries, homes. The immediate blast would be followed by something worse. A black rain of radioactive fallout would begin to drift down. It would contaminate the land, the water, the air. Those who survived the initial explosion would face a slow, invisible death from radiation sickness. There would be no hospitals to help them, no doctors, no medicine. The infrastructure of society would cease to exist. Communication would be gone. No radio, no television, no way to know what was happening. Scientists called the next phase nuclear winter. Smoke would shroud the sky, the sun dimmed, temperatures plunging, crops failing, life chains broken, famine spreading across the world. The world pulled back from the brink. The Soviet ships carrying missiles stopped, turned around before reaching the quarantine line. In the tense back-channel negotiations, an agreement was reached. The United States publicly promised not to invade Cuba. Secretly, Kennedy agreed to remove American nuclear missiles from Turkey. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced the missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and returned. The crisis was over. A collective sigh of relief went around the globe. The tension that had held the world captive for 13 days began to ease. The immediate danger had passed. The world had looked into the abyss and stepped away. Relief and shock coexisted. The crisis left a deep scar and a sobering lesson. Kennedy and Khrushchev were shaken by how close they'd come to mutual destruction. They'd been pushed by military systems and hardline advisors toward war. The experience changed them. They saw they needed better ways to communicate and better ways to manage crises. Months later, the first steps toward de-escalation were taken. In June 1963, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established. A direct teletype link between the two leaders meant to prevent misunderstandings. Later that year, the US, USSR, and UK signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. It banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. A small step away from the nuclear shadow. The moment had passed, leaving a fragile but essential lesson. Survival depended on cooperation. We must remember the lessons from this moment of near catastrophe. These are not just points of history. They are vital warnings for our present and our future. The first lesson is about the fallibility of systems. The Cold War was built on complex command and control systems. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved those systems were not perfect. Technology can fail. Information can be incomplete. Misunderstandings can happen. The fate of the world rested on flawed human beings making decisions under unimaginable pressure. Power without restraint is a recipe for disaster. The second lesson is the critical importance of communication. Slow formal channels and urgent back channels both mattered, but delays were dangerous, and misinterpretation was easy. The hotline admitted that need. When adversaries can speak, they are less likely to assume the worst. A third, profound lesson comes from quiet acts of courage. We owe our existence to those who chose to hesitate. Vasily Arkhipov, in the belly of his submarine, questioned an order rather than blindly obeyed. President Kennedy defied military advisors who urged immediate attack. He chose the harder path of the blockade. These were decisions not to act, choices for restraint under immense pressure. In a world armed for instant warfare, the greatest strength can be the will to pause. We look at archival photos and see history, young men in uniform, leaders with worried faces huddled over maps, grainy images of missile sites. These are not mere relics. They are evidence. They are proof of how close we came. They remind us our continued existence is not guaranteed. It resulted from past choices, and it will depend on the choices we make in the future. In the end, the missiles were removed. The ships sailed home. The world kept turning. People went back to their jobs, their schools, their families. Most had no idea how close they had been to never seeing another sunrise. The details of encounters like the one with the B-59 submarine emerged decades later. Archival files and declassified reports came to light. The full story revealed a truth more terrifying than people knew. Humanity's survival wasn't grand strategy. It rested on the calm judgment of a few in the heat of the moment. The most dangerous moment in history ended with a decision not to act. A silence instead of a launch. A withheld order. A hand that did not push the button. Because of that pause, humanity survived. This memory must be kept alive. Not to create fear, but to inspire caution. Immense power requires greater wisdom. The most dangerous moment in history ended with a decision not to act. And humanity survived.